begin with a good friend, editor of Mobilization, and sociologist par excellence, Neal Caren.
And thanks to Hank for putting this whole thing together. Our paper is called Tactics, Favorability, and Issue Salience of U.S. Movements. And I don't think people understand like Hank's role in mobilization and how he like handcrafts. Like people submit things and then we accept them, and then Hank like continues to edit and refine and improve. And so, for example, even for this was not the title of my paper. Hank rejected the title of my thing and rewrote the title. Thanks. And this is joint work with Jennifer Earl at Arizona, Edwin Amenta at Irvine, and Sarah Soule at Stanford University. None of those people are here today, so it sucks. It's all their fault. Okay, so what I want to talk about a little bit is sort of social movement outcomes and the tactics that they use to get them. And so, a primary outcome that social movements are historically interested in is, new legislation, new policies, new state-oriented benefits. And so beginning to think about the process which leads, to get from the process that leads to these policy outcomes, right? And as the intermediate step, we often have politicians, right, who are, the ones who actually craft and or make these decisions. Sort of the goal that social movements have, and the reason we're all here, right, is we think that social movements are on some level able to influence politicians in a way that sort of legislation gets passed. This is sort of sociology, social movements 101, thinking about it. And of course, there's been volumes of research and things about this for decades, and particularly noting that, social movements are better at some steps of the policy process than others, and so more likely to get legislation than congressional hearings and other sorts of benefits, right? So that is, they're better earlier in the policy process than they are later on when more institutional actors take over. And sort of once you step outside of the realm of social movements, then we can often think about other sorts of inputs that go into the policy project. All right, and so the one that sort of I want to particularly focus on today is the one that sort of political science begins with as their foundational thing. That is public opinion, right? With the sort of the basics, the cores of sort of the undergraduate understanding of political science and our sort of lay understanding of the world is that politicians are responsive to public opinion. And that, so that when they are looking and crafting legislation, certainly there's one input from social movements, or maybe there isn't, and one from but they are also paying attention to public opinion. And in fact, when some scholars look at this, right, for example, Paul Burstein or others will say that, in fact, the role of social movements in affecting things is quite small, right? Once you control for the role of public opinion, then the sort of direct influence of social movements is modest at best, or is zero. Alternatively, others have argued that, right, it's this interaction effect, that is this joint effect, that is the combination of social movements and public opinion that makes a difference. Anyway, so this is in Marco Giuni's pieces in 2007 and 2009 that talked about the joint effects things. All right, but also, right, social movements don't just care about policy-related outcomes. Sometimes, right, protesting is to raise awareness about their issue, so that people care about it and either change their opinion about something. And so think here about like the LGBT movement over time has been interested in people changing attitudes about things, or more recently, movements like the Occupy movement, which is, on some levels had policy and other goals, but whose primary contribution was to raise awareness about the issues of income inequality in the United States. And so it's, to be honest, it is insane that I'm the only one who gets to look, oh God, at this dinosaur, right? And like, this is what you people are missing. Right, because that shows the impact of the movement. You could show like a dinosaur and you're like, oh yeah, I know what that's about. Like, he's got the We Are the 99, right? So there's this cultural impact of social movements. Okay, Right, and so this goes back, and when we talk about, for example, in a Mainsbridge article before mobilization existed, but cited in mobilization, talks about the ERA campaign, which forced Americans to keep thinking about the issue. So the result was both creeping feminism and creeping anti-feminism. See, women on the march. You don't understand, there was a 5-hour plane ride devoted to finding these pictures. Okay, and so which brings us like to the actual subject that we're interested in is to what extent are social movements able to impact public opinion? And so prior, for the most part, many scholars have considered public opinion to be a separate thing from mobilization. And so going again back to the Juni work in mobilization, he argues that this is an external factor to the movement similar to political opportunities, right? These are things beyond the movement's control. So what we wanted to look at is to what extent is this true, right? Is public opinion totally independent of movements, or instead are movements able to impact public opinion? And there's a little evidence that there is some academic evidence that it can. And so I'm thinking here of the 2016 Leanne Benaznak piece on public opinion as a movement outcome that was published in Mobilization. That showed that there was, for at least in the case of the women's movement, that there was a short-term and a longer-term effect. So that is, when there was just an increase in protests, people were more likely to have feminist attitudes, and this was in the quarter after the protests and in subsequent quarters as well, right? So it raised awareness, and people actually began to, become more feminist. Okay, so here's what we did. We used some public opinion data. We went to the Roper Center, which I would argue is now housed at Cornell University, which I would argue is an underutilized resource for scholars of all sorts, because instead of just like the NES or the GSS or whatever, right? They host all these surveys, including decades of Gallup surveys and a host of other folks who run surveys. And we, including Sarah Gaby, who's somewhere in the audience, right there she is, downloaded surveys about everything we could think about that was related to social movement outcomes, because we were interested not just in the women's movement, but potentially all different kinds of social movements, right? So we have questions about abortion and a series of them really on the spots. Civil rights, the environmental movement, the LGBT movement, civil liberties, the Christian right? And so what we did was gather all the possible survey questions that were asked about that movement using a variety of keyword searches, and then looked at those questions that were asked one or more different years. Recoded each of the questions so that the pro-movement side was a yes, in order to get like a stable time trend across the time periods. Right? Okay. And so what we were able to identify was 11 different, and so to give it 11 different issues, had a sufficient number of questions that were asked over a number of years. And so then we aggregated them using the Stinson's factor analysis, which is like a time series factor analysis method that controls for the different questions being asked by different organizations, and that not all questions are asked in each year and things like that. To get, again, basic time period trends about whether people were becoming more or less sympathetic to the movements. And you can get a sense of things here. And again, this is just the snapshot between when the data began with the polling and then when our time period for all our other data ends, which is 1995, which potentially foreshadows what data sets we're also using. And you can, so over here on the left axis, this is how favorable people were to the issue, and you can see that over the 1980s, in fact, people became more favorable to abortion and reproductive rights, more favorable to civil liberties, not so much with the civil rights, probably because we missed this sort of earlier time period when I bet it went up and then down, but that's just a guess. More sympathetic to the environmental movement, increasing towards feminism, mixed on gun rights, right, with some distinct turning points here. Very favorable towards gun control here. This declines later on. And then this is the very beginning of the rise in LGBT rights, and then welfare rights declines. But anyway, so we see, right, these various different sort of trends over time. I talked about the polls. And so at the other end of things, right, we get counts of movements. And so for where we're getting the counts of the movements is the dynamics of collection action slide. Here we are. It's from the dynamics of collective action, right? The sort of big data set that many of us are using. And so simply here what we're doing is aggregating up the yearly counts of events as a first sort of crude measure of things. And this, again, gives you just an overall sense of like how many events were happening in a specific year. Right? And so this generally matches up with what you think it might be, right? So the anti-war movement peaked, you know, there and then was less afterwards. Civil rights were missing the sort of peak of that because there wasn't great questions in polling about that. You see like the rise and decline of the feminism as a mass sort of movement, our peak of the environmental movement in the 1970s, our LGBT movement peaking right there, but also get a sense of the sort of scale of things. Each Y scale is separate, and so you see, for example, there really just is not that many gun control sort of protest events over time. Okay, so and so our basic question is, right, what's the correlation between these two, right, events and public opinion? And so to give you a sense of like, should we expect something? As a first pass would be, well, here's the list, you know, in gray is the year of peak mobilization. Is this like a turning point? Is it associated with high values, low values, mixed? Mixed, so let's just move on. And then, so the second thing was, well, what if you know, a basic analysis, let's do a scatter plot, right? So on the x-axis, because we think that's the thing that's driving it, is the number of events. And again, this is just a first crude pass. And then the y-axis is our public opinion measure from before, right? And so when there's lots of events, are people more favorable towards your movement? Well, maybe for some movements. So let's see, well, no, actually it's the opposite direction there. When there's lots of movements, people are low on the environmental movement, the late 70s. Gun control fits a yes and yes, but again, that talks out at 4. Civil rights, it's like a big mess. Overall, right, this is not animals, but look at that y-axis, 39 to 42, not much change over this time period. Right? Overall, this would say there isn't like a very strong trend across all these movements about the relationship between public opinion and mobilization. And so then the next step would be a more rigorous actual regression analysis. So you want to include like a standard set of controls, unemployment, politicians. Again, this is dated, so it's like Michelle Bachmann, foundational support, things that might, again, affect things, time and year variables, sympathetic president, these sorts of things, right? That all the other factors that reviewer 2 might demand that you include in your model. And so here's what we get. When you run this sort of model, bam. Nothing, right? So public support, and so in this case, I'm actually lagging all the independent variables by a year. So the number of public events has no impact across all these social movements on support for it. Likewise, we looked at a measure of social movement organizations, their prominence, nothing, right? So no stars there. Include number of participants, okay, so nothing, we were wrong. You know what? The problem is that we were aggregating together too many things, right? There was a lot of different collective action events, and so let's look at maybe large sympathetic protests. Maybe these large events signal a different thing, more worthiness, unity, numbers, commitment than other events. And so like that our bystander publics are enthusiastic about it. On the other hand, like throwing stuff, people are less sympathetic to you, right? So these would turn off public opinion to the extent that there's riots and things like that. Strikes, less clear exactly what would happen. But again, we're gonna stick to we were wrong. So even if you divide out this issue, there's no statistically significant effects, right? So again, what these movements are doing, no one cares. Okay, so there's a second thing that's mentioned, right, is whether you have an opinion about it, right? Because again, like raising awareness of the issue. And so in this case, what we looked at was the number of NAs, right? The people who said, I don't know, I have no opinion on this issue. And again, it's like a hotbed of nothing. The one example, if you run it lots of different ways, thing that matters is riots decrease the percentage of people who have no opinion about the issue, which could be because by now we've tested a lot of different, like, you know, things fishing for statistical significance. It could also be, I could also tell the story that, well, riots turn the people who had no opinion against the issue on the issue against the issue. So thus they decrease the number of people who have an opinion. But then you say to yourself, But wait, didn't you just cite an article in Mobilization that said citizens adopt more liberal gender attitudes as the U.S. women's movement increases its activities? So literally, are you like, you know, discrediting an article in your very journal? And to this, I say no. Because if you break it out into the different movements, in particular, you can find that, wow, that was wrong. That, in fact, particularly on the issue of having an opinion and salience, that a certain number of movements, including the women's, feminism women's movements, and the civil rights movements, potentially the two movements that we study the most, in fact, these did, in their number of events and or the number of times organizations were mentioned, did increase people's awareness about the issue, right, as mentioned by having an opinion, right? So the more events, the more times organizations were in the paper, the more times people, you know, thought about the issue and cared about it, right? So the Mobilization article is right. So the takeaways: impacting public opinion isn't easy, right? Spanning across all these movements, the evidence is at most it's happening for a few of the movements, not for many, and not particularly surprising potentially what it's happening for is like, you know, civil rights. If we look back at the ones, it was civil rights and the women's movement. If you would list like, what were the two biggest movements during this time period, they would certainly be on your, you know, your Mount Rushmore of civil rights, of movements over this time period. Right, so protest might matter, well, see, this was more relevant when you were staring at them the whole time. But okay, so what we need to do as part of this, you know, is more generally think about, you know, what's the relationship between social movements and their sort of public opinion impact. There's certainly no sort of straightforward relationship going, not presented here. We looked at it in a lot more nuanced ways other than just the sort of annual counts, but sort of like in the days or months subsequent, very sorts of similar sorts of results. So this sort of, on the one hand, questions it. On the other hand, the slide that was supposed to go here but isn't at the moment, just trust me, is, is when we think about, maybe we need to think about this relationship differently. So that is, it is almost impossible to imagine the counterfactual world where sort of the advances for these various movements, and again, sort of women and cultural attitudes towards women over this 50-year time period, African Americans, and so the environment, all these other issues, sort of absent sort of critical moments of mobilization, absent protest waves, right? So potentially we need to start thinking about the role of protest waves in kicking off what are then sort of stable attitudes, right? So it shouldn't mean us as like people have, so again, thinking sort of more broadly and holistically about this relationship rather than in this sort of linear regression framework, which is the one I used. Thank you very much.